For decades, America and Canada had a relationship so predictable that almost nobody questioned it. The United States bought Canadian energy, Canada bought American products. Washington set the rhythm, and Ottawa moved with it. That was the assumption. That was the system. And systems can survive arguments. They can survive tariffs. They can survive angry speeches and political threats. What they struggle to survive is something much more dangerous, a change in behavior. Because right now, something unusual is happening beneath the headlines. While politicians argue in public, consumers are changing habits. While television cameras focus on trade disputes, energy markets are shifting direction. And while Washington keeps acting as if this is another disagreement that can eventually be negotiated away, Canada appears to be asking a different question entirely. What happens if dependence stops being one-sided? Because if Canada changes where its oil goes, if consumers stop buying American products, if old assumptions start breaking one by one, then this is no longer a story about whiskey bottles sitting on store shelves. This becomes a story about leverage, about power, about who actually needs whom. And for the first time in a very long time, America may not like the answer. I can do that style replication at a high level, but I can't closely imitate the exact writing fingerprint of the original script. I can create a new script that captures the same broad qualities: serious geopolitical storytelling, slow building tension, economic stakes, simple language, suspense, and a faceless documentary flow. I also need to avoid building the premise around an unverified claim. The title includes statements like Trump begs Carney and Canada cuts 1 million barrels per day from US, which read as factual events. Unless those happened and are sourced, I shouldn't present them as real. I can preserve the dramatic energy by framing it around pressure, negotiations, and strategic shifts instead of inventing events. Here's the hook plus section 1 in that style. Hook. For decades, America and Canada had a relationship so predictable that almost nobody questioned it. The United States bought Canadian energy. Canada bought American products. Washington set the rhythm, and Ottawa moved with it. That was the assumption. That was the system. And systems can survive arguments. They can survive tariffs. They can survive angry speeches and political threats. What they struggle to survive is something much more dangerous: a change in behavior. Because right now, something unusual is happening beneath the headlines. While politicians argue in public, consumers are changing habits. While television cameras focus on trade disputes, energy markets are shifting direction. And while Washington keeps acting as if this is another disagreement that can eventually be negotiated away, Canada appears to be asking a different question entirely. What happens if dependence stops being one-sided? Because if Canada changes where its oil goes, if consumers stop buying American products, if old assumptions start breaking one by one, then this is no longer a story about whiskey bottles sitting on store shelves. This becomes a story about leverage, about power, about who actually needs whom. And for the first time in a very long time, America may not like the answer. Section 1. The strange part of this story is that it did not begin with oil. It did not begin with pipelines. It did not begin with billion-dollar projects or global energy markets. It began with something much smaller: a bottle on a shelf. For years, American products moved into Canada with almost no one paying much attention. Wine from California, bourbon from Kentucky, whiskey from Tennessee. These products crossed the border as part of a relationship that felt permanent. Consumers bought them because they always had. Businesses planned around them because they assumed they always would. Then the atmosphere changed. Political language started becoming sharper. Trade discussions became more aggressive. Public comments that once sounded like normal disagreements slowly began feeling personal. And when politics starts feeling personal, people respond in personal ways. Consumers do not think like governments. Governments negotiate. Governments calculate. Governments wait. Consumers simply decide. One person changes what they buy, then another, then another. At first, it looks meaningless. A tiny action, too small to matter. But when millions of people start making the same decision at the same time, something changes. The movement inside Canada was not built around complex economic theories. It was built around something much simpler: buy local. Support Canadian businesses. Keep money inside the country. Simple messages spread quickly. And suddenly what looked like a political disagreement started becoming something much larger. Because governments can remove tariffs, governments can sign agreements, governments can hold meetings and stand behind podiums and announce progress, but governments cannot force people to want something. That is where Washington may have underestimated what was happening, because there is a major difference between a policy problem and a cultural problem. Policy problems can be negotiated. Cultural problems can last for years. Imagine being an American producer watching this happen. For decades, Canada represented one of the safest markets imaginable. A friendly country, a close partner, a reliable customer. Then suddenly sales begin falling. Maybe not everywhere at once, maybe not overnight, but enough to create anxiety, enough to create phone calls, enough for executives to start asking uncomfortable questions. Is this temporary or is something changing? Because markets are built on confidence, and confidence can disappear quietly. That is the dangerous part. Factories do not shut down because of one bad week. Investments do not disappear because of one argument. But when businesses begin thinking that consumer behavior itself is changing, they start making different decisions. Different hiring decisions, different production decisions, different investment decisions. And once those decisions start happening, reversing them becomes much harder. Meanwhile, far away from store shelves and consumer campaigns, another conversation was beginning. A much bigger conversation, one involving pipelines, one involving millions of barrels of oil, one involving Asia. Because while attention remained fixed on products people could hold in their hands, Canada was increasingly looking towards something else entirely, where its future customers might be. And that is where this story begins becoming much bigger than anyone expected. Section 2. Energy relationships rarely make headlines until they start changing. That is because the most powerful systems in the world are often the quietest ones. They operate in the background, invisible, predictable, reliable. People stop noticing them because they assume they will always be there. For decades, the relationship between Canadian oil and American industry worked exactly like that. Canada produced enormous amounts of oil, particularly heavy crude from Alberta. The United States bought most of it. American refineries were designed around it. Entire supply chains were built around it. Investments worth billions of dollars were made with one assumption sitting quietly underneath everything: Canadian oil would keep flowing south. Year after year, decade after decade, that assumption looked unshakable. And why would anyone question it? The United States was Canada's biggest customer by an enormous margin. Canada had limited options. Pipelines mainly pointed toward American markets. Geography seemed to make the decision automatically. The system looked permanent. But permanent systems have a weakness. People stop preparing for change. Because when something works for a very long time, confidence slowly becomes dependence. And dependence has a dangerous habit. It often reveals itself only after alternatives appear. That is where the conversation suddenly becomes uncomfortable. Because Canada is not asking whether it can sell oil. Canada is asking where it should sell oil. There is a huge difference between those two questions. For years, selling to America was the obvious answer because there were few realistic alternatives. If most pipelines move south, then most oil moves south. Simple. But what happens if new routes begin opening? What happens if access to international markets starts expanding? What happens if buyers on the other side of the world suddenly become serious competitors? Because across Asia, energy demand continues to matter at a massive scale. Countries need stable supply. Industries need fuel. Economies need certainty. And when uncertainty hits other energy-producing regions, buyers begin searching for alternatives. Canadian oil starts looking attractive. Reliable country, stable government, large reserves, long-term supply potential. Suddenly, Canada is no longer looking at a single giant customer. It is looking at multiple customers. And that changes the balance completely. Imagine walking into a negotiation where only one person wants what you are selling. Now imagine walking into the same room with 5 buyers competing. The conversation changes immediately. The price changes. The leverage changes. Everything changes. This is why discussions around pipelines create so much attention. Because pipelines are not just metal tubes crossing land. They are economic highways. They determine where resources go. They determine who gets access. And in many cases, they determine who holds power. For decades, power came from being Canada's largest customer. But if Canada gains more ways to reach global markets, then that power begins shifting. Slowly at first, then all at once. And this is where Washington may be facing a problem that tariffs cannot solve. Because tariffs work by changing costs. But they do not change geography. They do not stop new infrastructure. They do not erase global demand. And they certainly do not stop countries from looking for alternatives. While political debates continued, investors were paying attention to a different question entirely. Where will Canadian energy be flowing 10 years from now? Because if the answer becomes everywhere, then a relationship that once looked guaranteed suddenly starts looking optional. That is a word policymakers hate hearing. Optional. Because predictable systems create comfort. Optional systems create competition, and competition creates uncertainty. The uncomfortable reality for Washington is that uncertainty may already be appearing, not because Canada suddenly stopped producing energy, not because America suddenly stopped needing energy, but because the old assumption, the idea that Canadian resources naturally belong inside an American economic orbit, may be starting to weaken. And once assumptions begin collapsing, people start asking questions they never asked before. Questions that seemed impossible only a few years ago. Questions like this: what if Canada no longer needs to choose America first? Because if that question keeps getting louder, then the next chapter of this story becomes far more serious than a dispute over products sitting on shelves. It becomes a question of leverage, and leverage has a way of changing relationships very quickly. Section 3. This is where the story starts becoming less about economics and more about psychology, because trade relationships are not built only on numbers. They are built on assumptions, trust, and habits that form over decades, and habits can be incredibly powerful. For generations, the United States and Canada operated inside a relationship that felt almost automatic. There would be disagreements, there would be political arguments, there would be moments of tension, but beneath all of that was an understanding that neither side was going anywhere. The foundation always seemed stable, which is exactly why shifts become difficult to see while they are happening. Because big changes rarely arrive like explosions. They arrive like cracks, small at first, almost invisible, easy to dismiss, until suddenly everyone realizes the structure itself has changed. And that may be the deeper problem emerging beneath the headlines. Because when people hear words like boycott, many imagine a government issuing orders, a law, a restriction, a policy decision. But consumer movements do not work that way. They move differently. They spread through conversations, through families, through social media, through millions of small decisions that individually look meaningless. One person chooses a different bottle. One family decides to buy local products. One customer checks labels before putting something into a shopping cart. None of these actions seem important by themselves. But markets do not measure emotion. Markets measure behavior. And behavior is exactly what appears to be changing. That is what makes this situation harder to predict. Governments know how to negotiate with governments. Businesses know how to negotiate with regulators. But how do you negotiate with millions of individual choices? You cannot hold meetings with them. You cannot threaten them. You cannot pressure them. You cannot announce a deal and expect them to instantly change how they feel, because feelings operate on a completely different timeline. And once national identity becomes involved, things become even more complicated. People begin seeing everyday purchases differently. Suddenly, buying local products stops feeling like shopping. It starts feeling like participation, like contribution, like loyalty. And once a movement begins creating that emotional connection, reversing it becomes much harder than starting it. That is why businesses pay attention not only to sales numbers, but to sentiment. Because declining sales can recover. Damaged perceptions can last much longer. Executives understand something politicians sometimes forget. Customers remember experiences. Countries do too. And this is where the timing becomes particularly interesting. Because while attention stayed focused on short-term arguments, larger forces in the world economy kept moving. Energy markets continued shifting. Supply chains continued changing. Global alliances continued evolving. And Canada was watching all of it, carefully. Because if the world itself is becoming less predictable, then dependence starts looking riskier. Think about it from Canada's perspective. If one customer buys the overwhelming majority of your exports, that relationship feels beneficial during good times. But during difficult times, it can begin feeling vulnerable. What happens if political tensions rise? What happens if policy suddenly changes? What happens if decisions made in another capital start affecting your entire economy? These are not new questions, but they may be receiving new attention. Diversification suddenly starts sounding less like an economic strategy and more like protection. Protection against uncertainty. Protection against pressure. Protection against depending too heavily on one direction. And once that mindset starts spreading through political and business circles, something important happens. The conversation itself changes. The question stops being, how do we return to the old system? And becomes, what should the next system look like? That is a very different conversation. Because people trying to restore something are looking backward. People designing something new are looking forward. And if Canada has started thinking in those terms, then Washington may be dealing with something larger than a temporary disagreement. Because temporary disagreements end. Structural changes do not. They reshape everything around them. And far from the television cameras and public speeches, one reality was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. The balance between customer and supplier was slowly starting to evolve. And when balances shift, power usually shifts with them. The only question is who notices first.